Okay, it seems like people are slowly flooding in. Well, good morning. Welcome to Creating a Home for Everyone. How can realtors promote integration? This webinar is hosted by Open Communities Alliance and the Greater Hartford Association of Realtors, specifically the Bridge Committee. We have worked months. We've been working for months to get this together, even through a pandemic and busy schedules. We finally have been able to host this dynamic conversation. Today, we will hear from Bryan Greene, the Director of Housing Policy at the National Association of Realtors, Freiberg, the Executive Director for Housing out in New York, and Erin Boggs, the Executive Director of Open Communities Alliance, who I have the pleasure of working with every day. My name is Taniqua Hughley. I am the Outreach Director for Open Communities Alliance. I will be in and out of the conversation and in the chat box. I will moderate the discussion later on this morning. If you have any questions concerning technical issues, please send me a private message. And just for Zoom etiquette, please, everyone, keep yourself on mute. I think, well, this is a webinar feature, so everyone will be muted during the discussion portion. We can unmute you if you would like, or you can just submit your question in the chat box. I will pass it over now to Lucas Nash, a representative of the Bridge Committee and a Century 21 Realtor.
Thanks, Taniqua. My name is Lucas Nash. I'm the 2020 chair of the Bridge Committee at GHAR, the Greater Hartford Association of Realtors. We founded the Bridge Committee back in 2013 to expand opportunities for participation and leadership to people of color and other underserved members of our association. And since then, we've broadened the scope of our mission to include the disenfranchised and oppressed in the communities that we serve. We believe that realtors and other members of the real estate industry, both historically and today, have participated in the segregation of Black and brown folks through practices such as steering, blockbusting, and redlining. As such, we as realtors have a pivotal role to play in undoing some of this harm. So we're excited to partner with the OPA, and with that, I'll hand it back to Taniqua.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Lucas. Can everyone hear us okay? Tell us where you're from, write it in the chat box. I hope everyone got their breakfast ready, have coffee, because this is a conversation that is needed, especially in Connecticut. I do know that we have a few attendees that are not from Connecticut, and this information can be applied as well. And so this session is recorded. So if you have to step away, don't worry, we'll have a recording where you can go back and check it out. It's not too late to register. So if you have friends who you believe should be in this session and they need to hear from Fred and Bryan, please send them the link. They can still join us. And so I first would like to recognize our sponsors. During this time, these two sponsors still found the way to assist us to ensure that we make this conversation happen. And so we would like to recognize the National Association of Realtors and CADIC. These are our two sponsors for the webinar event. So thank you. I know that we have representatives, aside from Bryan, from NAR on the webinar and from CADIC as well. So a little flow for the morning. We will first start off with Erin Boggs, the Executive Director of OCA, who will talk about the impact and contributing factors of segregation. And she'll talk a little bit about OCA as well. And then followed by Fred Freiberg, who will talk about the historical role of realtors and the Long Island testing. So some of you may already know Fred, but he'll share the story for people who may not be familiar with the Long Island testing. And then we'll follow up with Bryan Greene, who will talk about the National Realtors Action Plan and the role realtors can play. I know that there has been, at least Erin and I, we have received a lot of emails recently from people in suburban towns and landlords and realtors who are trying to figure out how they can help in this day and age with all that is going on across the nation today. So Bryan will definitely give us some action items. And then we'll wrap up with questions and discussion. So again, please feel free to write your questions in the chat, and the chat will be monitored. So I'm going to pass it on to Erin. Thank you. We can't hear you. Give me a second.
Nope, we're good. Thank you everyone for being here today. I didn't pay attention to my note that said unmute myself, but now I'm going to just share my screen and we'll get going. Okay, so just for those of you who are not familiar with Open Communities Alliance, we are a statewide nonprofit. We work with an urban-suburban coalition, and we work to advocate for access to opportunity, particularly through promoting balanced, affordable housing development, including in thriving communities. But we recognize there's, an additional component beyond our real focus, which is on, sort of the government role in creating affordable housing and opportunities. And that extends to the role of home ownership and the role of realtors. So we're very excited to be partnering with the GHAR Bridge Committee on this effort. Part of what drives our work is the recognition that Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the country. And on this map, you can see for those reddish brown areas are the most segregated areas of the country. Connecticut and large parts of the Northeast are more segregated than any area in the South. So I think this is kind of a shocking map for people to see, and an important thing to understand as we move forward with this work. Part of the way we look at segregation is we think about what it means for access to opportunity. And by opportunity, we mean the sort of web of resources that we know through all kinds of research are likely to lead to success later in life. So we do something called opportunity mapping, where we map the access to opportunity in different parts of the state and look at things like how the schools are doing, whether jobs are available, what the crime rates are, what the poverty rates are. And we generate a map like this. The dark orange areas are places that are really thriving. The lightly shaded areas are places that need more investment. And the scale is from very low opportunity up to very high opportunity at 5 levels. We then map this with various things, including where families of color are living. So in this next slide, that's where families of color are living in Connecticut, those blue dots. And as you can see, there's a real correlation between areas that are struggling and areas where families of color are living. And so I never talk about an achievement gap when I think about schools. I talk about an opportunity gap. So 73% of Blacks and Latinos are living in low and very low opportunity areas, those 2 lowest of the 5 categories. That's true for 26% of whites and 36% of Asians. And combined with other forms of discrimination, what really a history that underlies this and current practices have led to is a real disparity in income and wealth for families of color. And, in Connecticut, Blacks and Latinos earn about half or less of what whites are earning. And across the country, Blacks and Latinos have about half of the wealth, or excuse me, 1/10 of the wealth of whites. And in this analysis, that disparity is predicted to get even greater and move to 1% of the wealth that whites have. And this has a huge impact in terms of being able to retire in a way that is, reasonable in the sense of being able to pay for education for children in the sense of having a cushion if things go badly. So what we do with our real estate market, what's possible in terms of home ownership, is really critical to all kinds of financial stability. So what are the causes of segregation? There are many. Government policies, both in the past and today, around subsidized housing and zoning are part of it. Private acts of discrimination contributes to segregation. Industry acts and practices can promote segregation. The income disparities I just talked about, if towns have done zoning in such a way that only more expensive houses are available, and we understand those income disparities, you can see where that leads. And individual choice is something that people often point to, but it's actually less of a factor than I think people really understand. And one person who's done a lot of work on this, one researcher, is a woman named Maria Kreisen. And she's really dug into where people want to say they want to live, where they actually look, and where they actually end up living. And as you can see from this chart, in that first column of pie charts, white people say they want to live in neighborhoods that are about 46% white. Black people say they want to live in neighborhoods that are about 37% Black. Latinos say they want to live in neighborhoods that are about 32% Latino. So everybody's leaning a little bit towards their own race, but actually those numbers aren't that drastically different from each other. And then you've got to consider where people actually look. So whites look in places that are much whiter than they said they were interested in. Blacks look in places that are almost exactly what they said they wanted, and that's the same for Latinos as well. And then the next question is where people end up living. So white people end up living in areas that are much, much whiter than they say they want. And, you know, maybe they're saying they want more diversity than they really do. Maybe other factors enter into it, like real or actual school performance and things like that. Blacks don't live in areas that reflect what they say they are looking for. And I think part of what's going on here is discrimination, and that's true for Latinos as well. So that's why this discussion about what's going on and what's driving segregation and discrimination in that housing search process is really important. We also know that this interest in having wider choices in where to live is also true for families who use government housing vouchers, like Section 8, also known as the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or the State Rental Assistance Program. In our surveys of families who live in Hartford, we have found that close to half, 45%, are actually interested in housing choices outside of Hartford. So, there's an interest in choice at that point in the search process for that cohort as well. So realtors obviously are a big part of this. Realtors are selling homes, but they're also selling neighborhoods. And one thing that is obviously important to people based on that research is the notion of diversity. And selling diversity as a benefit of a neighborhood can be incorporated into what is done by a realtor. Another thing that I think is important is understanding the history and myths around affordable housing, which can have an impact on a discussion of a neighborhood, and understanding that done right, affordable housing and multifamily housing, mixed income housing does not have a negative impact on schools, property values, crime rates, et cetera. The other thing that realtors can touch on is discrimination, obviously, but also discrimination with regard to families who have vouchers and clients who are landlords, and helping them understand that there's a rule that prevents that in Connecticut, but also that there's some really positive elements to renting to families who have Section 8, not only from a desegregation social justice perspective, but also from the perspective of having a reliable reliable rent and having sort of this longer term tenant. So, there's some really good things there, and that's just one piece of some work that Open Communities Alliance is doing going forward is trying to connect with landlords around the benefits of the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher Program. So we would love to be in touch with any of you who'd like to partner on that going forward. You know, obviously at the heart of all this is the Fair Housing Act and other laws that protect against discrimination. I'm just throwing them in here because we'll have this slideshow available in case you want it for future reference. But one thing I think people often don't realize is there's actually a prohibition on segregation and discrimination within the Connecticut state constitution. So beyond federal laws, state laws on fair housing very specifically, there's you know, Article 1st, Section 20 of the Connecticut Constitution that talks about ensuring that discrimination and segregation are not happening. So I will end it there, and I will hand it off to Fred Freiberg, who I have known for a very long time, and you will read his bio in the program booklet, but he has incredible experience both at the Department of Justice with the Fair Housing Justice Center in New York, and I'm so excited that he's here to share his experience and wisdom with us. And he will be followed by Bryan Greene, who's with the National Association of Realtors, but prior to that was for many years doing fantastic work at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So with that, I will unshare my screen and hand it over to Fred.
Great, thank you, Erin. And I will share my screen now. First of all, thank you very much for including me in this important event. Thanks to the Open Communities Alliance and to the Bridge Committee of the Greater Hartford Board of Realtors. It's a particular pleasure to be on this panel with my colleague and good friend of many decades, Bryan Greene. So I look forward to the discussion that follows the presentations today. So my task in this morning's presentation is really to talk about the history of residential racial segregation and some of the current evidence we have of continuing housing discrimination. And as Taniqua mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Newsday investigation. So I'm going to cover probably nearly 100 years of history in about 23 minutes. So this is a bit of a challenging task, but I'm up for it. So it's very important to understand the answer to the question why fair housing matters, to look at the role of the real estate industry and government in having created residential racial segregation in our metropolitan areas. It's also important to acknowledge the continuing problem of racial discrimination in housing. So I'm going to talk about those two things. And we kind of start in the late 1800s, because prior to an organized national real estate industry of any kind, if you look at the 1880 and 1890 census, you'll find that there are no cities in the country that have really pronounced patterns of racial segregation. And so the question always is, what happened to change that? You had the beginnings of the Great Migration, where African-American families were moving from the south to the north. And while they were meeting up with discrimination and sometimes even violence in trying to secure housing, there was not a systemic discrimination in the way we think about it today. And people were able to buy farms and homes and rent apartments and so forth in a variety of areas, depending upon the willingness of the white seller or landlord to sell or rent to them. So one of the first things that happens is a Supreme Court decision in 1896 in Plessy v. Ferguson, which unfortunately established the legal foundation for segregation and all of the Jim Crow laws that followed. The other development that occurred was the early formation of the organized real estate industry in the form of the National Association of Real Estate Exchanges in 1908. And by 1913, this association had already instructed its members not to contribute to race mixing. At the same time, the real estate industry was becoming organized. Local planners in communities in 17 states around the country were drafting and enacting racial zoning ordinances. And racial zoning ordinances are a part of America's history as well, because what they did is essentially laid out where people could or could not live based upon their race. And we often think of apartheid in South Africa as having similar maps. We had them in the country as well, not everywhere, but we did have them in a lot of communities. And even though in 1917, the Supreme Court ruled that such ordinances were unconstitutional and thus unenforceable, racial zoning continued for many years after that. And the NAACP spent nearly 35 years litigating against communities that were continuing to use racial zoning laws to maintain segregation. Now, NARE, the early real estate association, changed its National Association in 1916, and we know this is the precursor to what we now know as the National Association of Realtors. NAREB advocated the use of race-restrictive covenants and the development of homeowners associations to protect developments. And of course, by saying protect developments, it was protecting them against the possible, what is often referred to as the invasion of these developments by people who are African-American or other people of color. And so this became a major focus of the National Association of Real Estate Boards. If you haven't seen a race-restrictive covenant before, I wanted to pull one up from 1919. This covers an entire neighborhood in the suburb of Wauwatosa, Wisconsin. See, it basically states that no one can purchase, own, lease, or occupy housing in this community other than a person of the white race. And that extended to all people of color, African Americans, as well as Jewish people. There were no Jewish people allowed in this subdivision either. And then there's always the carve out for domestic servants who might occupy the dwelling unit. And this was a fairly typical example of a race restrictive covenant. And covenants didn't always just pertain to that deed or that property. Many times they extended to the entire plat or subdivision in which they were located. NAREB adopted and enforced a new code of ethics, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this code of ethics, but it existed from 1924 to 1950. And basically what it does is it establishes the ethical duty of a realtor to discriminate based on race. That's right, it was the ethical duty of a realtor to discriminate. And so, of course, that meant some things. What that meant is that if you violated Article 34 by not discriminating in your real estate practice, you could be and would be sanctioned and possibly even expelled by the local board of realtors. And there are examples of that that occurred around the country. I know there's a discussion today about whether realtors who are involved in illegal discrimination should be sanctioned or expelled from local boards of realtors. And as you can see, for discriminating, and as you can see, for violating the Article 34 of the Code of Ethics, boards actually did expel realtors for this purpose. The General Counsel of the National Association of Realtor Boards was very passionate about promoting racial segregation. So he took the Code of Ethics and he wrote to all 50 states, or all of the states in the country at that time, and he basically wanted them to adopt it with their licensing boards, so that it would not only be the ethical duty of all realtors to discriminate, but it would be the ethical duty of all real estate licensees to discriminate in housing. And that Code of Ethics was adopted by 32 states. So the impact of the real estate industry in establishing this ethical code impacted far beyond members of the trade association. And then NAREB leadership coordinated and supported many efforts by local boards to develop plans, or what were often referred to as black belts, to restrict African-American populations from moving into white areas. So there was, and there was an effort in 1927 to actually dispense to all members of NAREB a model race restrictive covenant. And you can see, unlike the Wauwatosa race restrictive covenant that I showed you a moment ago, this one very clearly focuses just on African-American people. And so that this was clearly designed to restrict any African-American person from occupying housing. And these race restrictive covenants proliferated across the country with the assistance of real estate people. And on top of that, were enforceable by state courts of law. So this isn't just something that appears on the deed but doesn't mean anything. It could actually be enforced in most state courts around the country. And it was so effective. In fact, if you look at the activities from 1910 to 1928, and this is prior to the Depression, prior to the federal government getting involved in housing activity, by that time, half of all homes owned and occupied by white people in the nation had deeds with race restrictive covenants. So this massive effort by government with racial zoning, by the real estate industry to promote segregation had really had an impact, a profound impact on where people could live by race. And of course, after the Depression, the federal government got involved because it was trying to rebuild the middle class in the country. And so one of the concerns it had was that white middle class people particularly were struggling to pay their mortgages and hold on to their homes. So a homeowners loan corporation was started in 1934. And part of the way in which the federal government was going to make loans to people was through the use of these residential security maps. So these maps were, many of you have seen them. They've been on social media quite a bit and in newspaper articles and academic journals. But basically they shaded different areas of a city or metropolitan area by color, and areas shaded in red were largely occupied by African-American people, and those were areas in which no loans were allowed to be made. And so that's where the term redlining comes from. Now, it should be made very clear that lenders were discriminating long before the federal government came up with this HOLC program. But this really codified, by making it a government program, really codified the practice of discriminating wholesale against communities in which African Americans resided. You continue to have then more developments with the establishment of the Federal Housing Administration, which is the precursor to HUD. And FHA basically adopted many of the practices of the HOLC and continued to make loans available to home buyers across the country. And they got involved in the appraisal process. They had an official form which required appraisals to note the racial makeup of a neighborhood. And Frederick Babcock, who was one of the authors of, is a famous person in terms of real estate, but also is one of the authors, went to work for the Federal Housing Administration and actually authored many of the underwriting manuals, which you can see were again designed to ensure that FHA did not make loans in areas that were being occupied by African Americans and other racial groups, minority racial groups. During the 1930s, public housing was operated on a segregated basis. And of course, when you get to the 1940s, the Veterans Administration established many programs so that returning veterans from World War II could obtain mortgages. But unfortunately, the VA adopted the same underwriting practices that the FHA had. So those mortgage opportunities were not available to many African American veterans. And you'll, of course, many of you who are old enough to remember World War II. In World War II, soldiers fought in separate units based on race. So coming back to this country, it was a stunning development that some of the benefits that veterans were supposed to receive for having defended this country were not available to people on the basis of race. By 1948, and that's a significant date for a number of reasons, 85% of all new residential developments in the United States were racially restricted. So you can see how pervasive the impact was of all of these different actions that I've referenced. And of course, there are many more. I'm giving you the abridged version of this history. The Supreme Court in 1948 in Shelley v. Kramer ruled that race restrictive covenants could no longer be enforced in courts of law, but that did not deter boards of realtors and local sellers to go ahead and put race restrictive covenants on deeds going all the way into the 1950s, and I even know of some that appeared in the 1960s. So race restrictive covenants did not end with the Shelley v. Kramer decision. They simply could not be enforced in courts of law. FHA and VA loan programs made home ownership available to the majority of Americans, but what you find is that most of those loans were made to white individuals And I want to just point out a couple things on this slide. Hold on one second. Between 1934 and 1969, homeownership rates increased from 44 to 63%. But during the same period, less than 1% of African American population were able to obtain a mortgage through these programs. So these were programs that essentially propped up the white middle class and the opportunity, made the opportunity of homeownership possible. As a result, the opportunity to create intergenerational wealth through homeownership was denied to most African American households. And many, I didn't go through the details of this, but many of the white men who crafted and influenced the discriminatory policies of the federal government during the 30s and 40s had actually come out of the real estate industry. They were architects of these segregationist policies and the white supremacist ideology that was for so many years advanced by the burgeoning real estate industry. So now I want to bring it up a little bit more to contemporary times and just mention that I got involved in fair housing in 1976 when I went to work for a neighborhood organization in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And my introduction to this issue was that my board president made a presentation at an annual luncheon of the Milwaukee Board of Realtors. And at that presentation, he made the statement that he felt racial steering and block busting and other racially discriminatory practices were going on in the real estate industry. And as soon as he made that statement, he was booed and heckled by the participants in the Board of Realtors luncheon, and then was actually forced off the platform from speaking with chants of "prove it, prove it." And so prove it we did. We then embarked on a 14-month testing investigation, which showed how widespread racial steering was with 4 of the largest real estate firms in Wisconsin. And as a result of our litigation, 2 firms were no longer in business, and a 3rd firm left the residential sales business. And the 4th company settled with our organization. So I learned the value of testing in proving up discrimination, where you have people who are either ignorant about the existence of the discrimination, or too often were simply in denial and refusing to accept the premise that discrimination was going on. I will tell you that since coming to New York in 2004 and starting the Fair Housing Justice Center in 2005, over the last 15 years, my organization has done many investigations in the rental market, some in the sales market, some in lending, and we continue to find that racial discrimination is still pervasive and that people are still having their housing choices severely limited based on racially discriminatory practices. These practices reinforce residential segregation, and they sustain a very vicious cycle of inequality similar to what Erin talked about earlier. Now, I want to mention the Newsday investigation. I hope many of you have had an opportunity to view the 40-minute documentary called Testing the Divide that was released in November of 2019. But basically, this was a more than 3-year investigation by a newspaper out on Long Island. And our involvement was first as a contractor, where we established the testing protocols, hired and trained the testers, and also, or rather just trained the testers and helped with recruitment. And then also actually loaned them a test coordinator to train their staff on how to coordinate testing. So we were intimately involved at the beginning of the investigation, and then I stayed on from 2017 to 2019 as an unpaid consultant on the project. And then the scope of the investigation was pretty phenomenal. There were only 25 testers involved. Some were Asian, African American, Hispanic, and white. 84 tests were completed. There was 240 hours of recordings. Most were audio and video recordings. 93 agents were tested in 12 major real estate companies. Those 12 companies, incidentally, accounted for over half of the sales on Long Island in a given year. And the testers obtained 5,763 listings during the tests. So what you should know about this is that it indeed was one of the largest journalistic investigations into real estate sales practices ever conducted in the country. And Newsday To their credit, received a Pulitzer Prize nomination, received a Peabody Award, and other recognition for their work on this project. And I think they're very deserving for having done this. The discrimination they uncovered and observed in the testing is that 19% of the time Asian Americans were discriminated against, 39% of the time Hispanics were discriminated against, and nearly half the time, 49% of African Americans were discriminated against. And the type of discrimination that was observed during the testing, we have found a great deal of racial steering. We found different terms and conditions, the most common being a white person is told when they arrive that they can go out and see homes right away. And when an African-American buyer arrives, they're told, well, have you been to a lender yet? If you haven't been pre-qualified, then I'm not taking you out to see homes. I'm not even telling you what listings are available. And that difference in services and treatment, and this is the same agent who made these comments, and more than one. And we also saw disparate treatment just in this provision of services to the testers as well. So overall, it was very alarming because, you know, just my basis of comparison is that in 1977, I was involved in the first HUD study, and in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, we found roughly a 63% rate of discrimination against African Americans in the sales market. To now find a 49% rate of discrimination in Long Island in the sales market is rather disturbing, because it shows we have not, it at least suggests we haven't made a lot of progress in this area, and that we have a lot more work to do. I just want to briefly mention some of the things Erin said and reinforce these. Consequences of historical and current discriminatory practices. It creates glaring racial disparities. It of course has adversely impacted African-American home buyers by saddling them with less equity, less wealth, more debt, and worse credit. It accounts for the growing racial wealth gap in this country. If you look at savings and assets versus debts, the average wealth of white households is $171,000. The average wealth of black households is $17,600. Again, that 10 times that Erin talked about earlier. The rate of black home ownership in the country, the current 30% point gap between black and white home ownership, is greater than it was in 1968, when racial discrimination was essentially lawful in this country. And today, the rate of home ownership for black college graduates is actually lower than for white high school dropouts. So housing discrimination continues to perpetuate residential segregation in our metropolitan regions. And as Erin mentioned earlier, residential segregation creates a really self-sustaining cycle of inequality. And what you see is that where people live really still matters. It impacts their lives, their access to transportation, quality education, employment opportunities, healthy foods, and good health care. It can even determine the level of exposure to noxious pollutants and allergens, susceptibility to certain diseases, and even life expectancy. And because the country right now is focused very much on eliminating systemic racism in all aspects of American life, I wanted to pull a quote from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar that appeared in the LA Times because I thought he eloquently stated sort of the nature of systemic racism. And I think it applies to housing as well as other areas. You know, racism in America is like dust in the air. It seems invisible, even if you're choking on it, until you let the sun in. Then you see it's everywhere. As long as we keep shining that light, we have a chance of cleaning it wherever it lands, but we have to stay vigilant because it's still always in the air. And I leave you with that, and I look forward to the discussion and hearing Bryan's presentation as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. So Mr. Greene, you have the floor.
There we go. Thank you, and thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you about what we've been doing to address many of these issues that Fred has highlighted. First, let me say there was a story in the New York Times 2 days ago, And it also made the national papers, rather local papers in Florida, highlighting the differences in appraisals that African Americans receive versus whites. And what was really fascinating about this story was the New York Times story featured an African American woman married to a white man who essentially did their own test. So Fred's been talking to you about testing. Many people intuitively understand testing and will sometimes do their own test when they sense there's discrimination occurring. And in this particular case, this biracial couple lived in a house in Jacksonville, Florida, and they had an estimate of what their house would sell for. They figured it would sell for about $450,000. They knew that some homes sold for $350,000, some for $550,000. They thought theirs would be right in the middle. And they had an appraiser come. And I can't remember whether this, I think this may have actually been a refinancing. They had an appraiser come, and the appraiser valued the house at $330,000, so lower than even their low end. And the African-American wife had a suspicion, and she decided to remove all of her photos and all of her Toni Morrison and Alice Walker books and anything else that may have identified the home as one in which Black people live. And the bank ordered a new appraisal. And this time she and her son went to the mall, and her white husband remained behind to meet the appraiser. They did the appraisal, and the appraisal came out at $465,000. So over $100,000 in difference over the median that they expected, and just one family, one house. Nothing had changed. So this, I think, underscores a number of issues that we at the National Association of Realtors are seeking to address. One, what appears to be ongoing discrimination, and not just in appraisals, but in a variety of real estate practices, and the possible systemic nature of it. And I think, you know, the other concern it underscores is just the difficulty in closing the wealth gap, if even in situations where African Americans own homes, they aren't reaping the full benefits of home ownership. And so I think altogether, the New York Times story really sort of illustrates the range of issues that we at the National Association of Realtors need to confront. So I want to tell you a little bit about how we're doing that and where we still need to go. So I joined the National Association of Realtors last year, last November, and that year, 2019, the Realtors had also created a fair housing policy committee. So the National Association of Realtors long recognized the need to do more on fair housing. It had a diversity committee for many years and what it called an equal opportunity committee for decades, but it created a fair housing policy committee to be more intentional to deal with the specific discriminatory practices that still occur. And I joined as the staff executive for that committee and as our director of policy. Within 2 weeks, this New York Newsday story that Fred told you about came out. And so I, of course, had joined NAR with my own ideas of things we needed to do. This Newsday story really focused my attention. And, you know, the story, which was a print story in addition to a 45-minute video, which is very compelling, really kind of crystallized my attention on 3 areas. First, there were many who habitually responded that the story demonstrated the need for more training. And I said, well, yes, training, but we've been doing training for 50+ years. If anything, it screams that there needs to be accountability. And so that was the first thing I said. There needs to be greater accountability. And I'll talk to you about how we want to do that. But also it illustrated that there was a cultural problem, that 52 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, many people felt it was still acceptable to do this, or for some reason felt compelled to treat people differently based on race. So I said, we have to deal with culture in the industry. And then, yes, training, but perhaps we need to do different training. That perhaps many real estate agents were getting classroom training and getting information regarding the laws, but that was not translating necessarily into how they do their jobs. That maybe there needs to be some training that help them better spot their bias, or help them actually make judgments on how to deal with different scenarios. And so together, the Accountability, Culture Change, and Training, spelled a handy acronym, ACT, and I just tagged an exclamation point onto that. And the leadership team approved an initiative, which they've resourced well, to do a bunch of things that further these different objectives. So in terms of, let me start with training. So in terms of training, which is, I think, sort of the bare minimum, we said we need to do a different kind of training. And so we launched implicit bias training to the extent that some of these actions were those actions of agents who maybe were trying to comply with the law or weren't aware that they were not complying with the law. We believe that implicit bias training can help people identify how they're treating people differently. And we partnered with one of the top organizations doing this kind of training and launched a video for starters, a 50-minute video in the midst of the pandemic that all of the agents at home could view to get an introduction to what implicit bias training was and how implicit bias can affect the real estate transaction. That was a precursor to a more in-depth training that we are now developing with the same organization. They're called the Perception Institute. And this will be a course that will be available to companies nationwide for their agents. And we're exploring how we can either make that mandatory or eligible for continuing education credits so that it reaches the widest range of people. So that we're exploring. So that form of training is key. If you haven't seen what's the introduction to this on our webpage, it is at nar.realtor/fair-housing. We're also doing what we're calling a fair housing simulation training, where online we are providing a training that puts you as an agent in a transaction or a series of transactions where you have to make judgments on how to deal with it. And it also plays with your perspective, and sometimes it may put you in the seat of the client, you know, in the middle of the transaction where you thought you were the agent, but you're actually the client, so you can begin evaluating it from a different perspective. And just presenting people with some very challenging examples where your response to them could have an impact on your reputation, your legal risk, or your income. So that is in the works right now. So different kind of training to really sort of work the muscles to identify where bias may occur and how you can interrupt it. Culture. One of the observations I made from the New York Newsday video was that there were 12 companies tested. 10 of them had significant findings against them. 2, despite having been tested multiple times, Newsday did not cite them with any findings. Multiple agents, multiple times. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. They're in the same market. These 12 companies together were responsible for 50% of the sales on Long Island. It would be instructive to find out what these 2 companies were doing differently that they did not find themselves cited. Doesn't mean they're necessarily perfect, but you know, something perhaps consistently they're doing differently. And that led me to an idea that we really should identify those people who are leaders in the industry, who are operating in the same market as everyone else, following fair housing practices, and don't believe there's any reason to discriminate to be prosperous. We don't know fully why people are still engaging in this discrimination, but many companies are not. And can we celebrate those leaders who are not engaged in discrimination as peer examples to others? And so we are working to produce a video. I'm pleased we're working with Fred Freiberg and his organization, who've produced some excellent videos in the past on fair housing, and putting together this video for the real estate industry as just an example of folks who are prosperous as real estate agents and holding up fair housing values. We're also doing some studies to just better understand what is happening. When New York Newsday released its investigation, they also ran several stories just about why discrimination may still occur today. There were some stories on steering and why in 2019, when the study came out, steering might be occurring. There's still some things we don't know. And I think for us to intervene and address these issues, we really should take a more systematic look at what is prompting agents today to engage in discrimination. So we have a study underway looking at that, looking at the motivators for discrimination. So another key effort underway. And finally, on accountability, you know, whether you're trained or not, and whether you are embracing fair housing principles or not, folks need to be held accountable. The laws have been on the books for 50 plus years, and our code of ethics have mandated non-discrimination for many decades, and we need to make sure that there is some consequence when people engage in discrimination. So one area we're looking at is the state licensing laws. People should lose their licenses if they engage in discrimination. One of the interesting things, however, is that testing, when you do testing, it's one of the only times you really get to see how different groups are treated. So many times people don't even know that they're facing discrimination when they meet with an agent. So there needs to be more testing. We're supporting more testing by private fair housing groups and by the federal government. And we want to see state licensing laws actually take action when people have engaged in discrimination. So we want to look at, or actually we've done a review already of all the state licensing laws throughout the country. And we want to work with our state association executives to explore how different ones can be strengthened. And so we've done a top-down look at all the different ones, the strengths and weaknesses, and what we can do to make sure we have better laws on the books. But still, I just want to underscore that even the best laws on the books only mean so much if people don't report it. So testing is going to be key to actually being able to identify the discriminatory practices and take action. And then we also want to help companies do that work too. And so we've announced that we're going to do some self-testing so that companies can actually survey what's happening in their companies in different markets and take corrective actions. So that's something that's underway right now. So all of these things we think can make a difference. But I want to stress that they're also just the bare minimum. You know, this is to make sure that in transactions going forward, there's no discrimination. That does not overnight mean we close the wealth gap in this country. It does not necessarily mean we close the home ownership gap in the country. I would hope it means it doesn't widen, but this is the bare minimum. And I say this is sort of, you know, do no harm. We need to also come up with plans to address the harm that's already been done, the harm that's been done over decades, which the real estate industry contributed to. There are some people in the real estate industry who, when they hear this history, say, well, yes, we followed the laws or participated in the laws as they were at that time, when the reality is, as Fred outlined, we were part of the development of those laws. We were actually in the room where it happened. And these laws were reinforcing the desires of the real estate industry and the population, the sentiments of the population. And so it's not as though we're here in 2020 and we have these gaps because, in the 155 years since slavery, it's been a slow course for African Americans to acquire wealth and buy homes. I mean, this has been a history almost from the get-go of violence, of fire bombings of homes, of exploitation, of exclusion from communities, as Fred outlined, redlining, racially restrictive covenants, contract for deed exploitation. So at every stage, we had people who were prosperous trying to move into communities and facing setbacks because of American racism. This famous case of the Dr. Ocean Sweet and his attempt to live in a community in Detroit and just being attacked by mobs of 1,000 people outside his home. So all of this history is there. Many people don't fully appreciate that created our segregated neighborhoods, and then that was maintained through a variety of practices, including government practices. And so we as an industry have a responsibility, a moral responsibility to confront that. And I fear that if we don't confront these issues directly, this could happen again. I mean, in our lifetimes with the subprime predatory lending period, we saw communities of middle-class African-American homeowners, many of whom owned homes free and clear. We saw them the targets of home improvement scams and others, who may have been in mortgages, refinance scams. So a whole range of things that have set back African-American wealth and have destroyed wealth gain or the opportunity to pass on intergenerational wealth. And then, when we even look at communities where African Americans were historically denied, many of those communities still have very small African American populations. People talk about Levittown and how the covenants in Levittown and the discriminatory practices result in Levittown today still being only 1% African American, and how much harder it is for an African American to buy a home in that community today, with those homes having appreciated significantly in 60 years. So we need a policy that both meets people where they're at and gets those people who are eligible for home ownership into home ownership, but we also need to be thinking about policies that recognize the history and why African Americans and other minorities are challenged in getting into home ownership. And I want to talk maybe a little bit about some things we should be thinking about. So of course, we should always be looking at whether our current practices are unfairly denying access to people. Are there things we can do to make sure people aren't unfairly denied access to credit? And many are looking at alternative credit, NAR, along with NAREB, that's the National Association of Real Estate Brokers, the African American Realtors, again, formed because they were originally excluded from the National Association of Realtors, but we're working with them as well as the Urban Institute, looking at some solutions. Alternative credit is one we really want to look at. We need to re-examine credit models to make sure that they're truly predictive and that there aren't other things that we can be examining for credit worthiness. We need to continue to support government in doing automated underwriting reviews of Fannie and Freddie, since most of the market looks to them for underwriting guidelines. So that's very, very important, and we support those efforts to do better oversight. And then, you know, within the industry, people are talking about some things that can be done, like looking at whether the names on applications are leading to discrimination. I don't know if that's the case, but can we actually do sales where the names of applicants aren't revealed until late in the sale? Some people suggest that indicating the financing on an offer when it's indicated could actually result in discrimination if minorities are disproportionately participating in the FHA program or a VA program. Something we would need to take a look at, but you know, another possibility, and a range of things we're looking at. I mentioned appraisals at the start of this. Certainly, if people are in housing, we can do something to make sure that our appraisals are free of discrimination. So this is, even before this New York Times story, has been an area that we've said we want to do more on. We just had a seminar looking at home valuations, and Andre Perry from the Brookings Institution talked to us about his research, which shows there's a 28% discount in appraisal valuations for African-American homes, one that cannot be explained by legitimate criteria. So that's an area we want to focus on. But beyond that, there are opportunities to work with private actors and others to see if there can be down payment assistance and other support that recognizes the past. You know, I know some politicians have looked at whether there can be programs focused on formerly redlined areas. That's something that should be explored further. There are others who have suggested that companies who've participated in past discrimination, redlining practices, et cetera, rather than some of the other symbolic efforts that they may be engaged in to demonstrate that they are doing a racial reckoning right now, might actually look at some practices they can now adopt to make up for practices of the past. So that's something that can be explored. And then I think states and communities can revisit their own past and see whether there are steps they can take to address past harm. Asheville, North Carolina, for example, is trying to address how urban renewal displaced minority communities. So much of this history is fairly recent, and there are families who were recently harmed by some of these practices. There can be engagement around that. That's something that states and localities can be looking at. And so the devil's going to be in the details for any proposed legislation, any paths forward. But this is the kind of thinking that we'll need to engage in if we're going to make systemic change. And the Realtors are there, and we're looking to be part of the solution. So thanks, and I'll be happy to take questions later.
Awesome. So thank you for sharing, Erin, Bryan, and Fred. That was definitely a load of information, but helpful. So we will move into the discussion portion. And so the first question, Fred, I think this is for you. Regarding the New York Times article in which the, actually no, Bryan, this may be for you. Regarding the New York Times article in which the appraisal was well undervalued the first time, it seems with appraisals being so clinical, is it thought that lenders are on board with this as well, besides an unethical appraiser? I'm trying to find any section on the appraisal grid that references diversity.
So I know lenders are often concerned when they see these appraisals come in low, and have been allies with many of the families, and they have a vested interest in making sure, you know, the properties are valued properly. So if that's the question, I mean, I do think lenders want to address this issue just as many consumers do. As to why this occurs, it's, I think many people believe that it's discrimination that may be the result of the lack of diversity within the appraisal industry. I think appraisers will tell you, well, they have their guidelines. And so the question is there implicit bias that is affecting what appraisers do? There's no question that a more diverse industry could only have a positive effect on it. So this is something that we're greatly concerned about. I said, even before the New York Times story, we began to roll up our sleeves to figure out what we can do here. And to me, this is just key. It's like, all right, well, we have, people in housing. This is the American dream and what, we stand for and support, and, want to see people gain equity. At the very least, we can make sure that they, realize the same potential as others.
Okay. And so we have a question from Natalie Mendez. What should local associations be doing to promote anti-discrimination practices among realtors specifically and housing integration? And so you answered this a bit, but maybe she's specifically talking about the Connecticut area.
Shall I jump in? I'm sure Fred has ideas too. Well, I mean, one, I think it was good that Erin shared demographics. And I strongly believe that people need to educate themselves as to just how we got here, because many just don't. And I was just looking at something in the news the other day where people just casually talk about Black neighborhoods and crime in Black neighborhoods. And it just kind of, you get the impression that people don't recognize we created these neighborhoods and we created the conditions in these neighborhoods. And so for starters, I think everyone needs to better understand their community, the forces that have created the conditions in their communities, and then, begin to examine what can be done, both from the standpoint of meeting people where they're at, recognizing the opportunities, for home ownership, for example, but then, should there be other governmental policy to, help, to help stabilize communities and, better invest in those communities. And what are the barriers to people living in other communities? HUD, as you know, is responsible for enforcing the Fair Housing Act. There's provision in the Fair Housing Act that's been there from 1968 called the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Provision. And that says that if communities are getting federal dollars, they can't use our taxpayer dollars to exclude people from communities. And but the exclusion isn't necessarily a sign at at the county or state line or city line. It's often practices within those communities. And so for 50 plus years, communities have been obligated to look at that if they want federal dollars. And HUD was on a path to make that stronger, and just recently the Department of Housing and Urban Development weakened that regulation. So this is a long-standing provision which communities, if they want to be prosperous communities and welcoming to all, really should stand up for and say, this is important work, and and we actually want to see the government support this and not weaken it. Like I say, it's been there in the Fair Housing Act for 50 plus years, and only very slowly have people begun to recognize the importance of that tool and the importance of the government standing behind it. And we need to do that now.
Okay, thank you. So please feel free to flood the chat or the question answer option with questions. We have some dynamic speakers here, and it'll be hard for you to get an answer from them any other time. So please feel free. And so I guess I'll ask Fred a question. Can you talk about some of the myths that realtors have, or perceptions that realtors have about integration. Because I know someone made a comment earlier and said there are so many terrible things that are said in or comments that were made. That's what the person said in social media groups. And even for me, so to promote this event, I joined different realtor groups and real estate groups, and some of them you may have to answer a few questions, and in some of them they say welcome to the new members, and in none of them did they say welcome to me as a new member. And so, can you talk a little bit about the myths of that realtors may have about integration, and even other realtors?
Well, one of the things to clear up, I think, and Bryan touched on this a little bit, is that realtors just come from the community, and they're represent in many ways the attitudes and biases of people in the larger community. And as we know, there's still a lot of racism out there, and people operate with bias and so forth, and that infects housing transactions. I was once told when we were getting involved in lender testing, well, you probably won't find much because loan officers, well, they're better educated and they're probably not going to discriminate the way real estate people do or landlords do and so forth. And I thought, well, that's preposterous. They also live in the same community. They have the same biases and so forth. And I was right about that. We actually found a considerable amount of bias in the testing we did in the lending area. The stereotypes, oddly enough, are not, perhaps not oddly at all, are rooted very much into this ideology that I talked about earlier with our history. And that is that somehow the notion that when a community becomes more diverse, it is to everyone's disadvantage. It is a bad thing to have happen. And that runs contrary to what many of us believe now, that diversity actually makes us richer and strengthens our community and so forth. And unfortunately, too many people still harbor the notion that when a community becomes more diverse, it is destined to have problems. And I think we have to continually confront that notion. The other thing I would say, and is partially in response to the last question that Bryan fielded, is we've been involved lately in pressing people to come forward, and basically say something when you see discrimination occurring. And you've heard this on the national media, you've heard it in relation to the police violence that has been going on. And I think it's true everywhere. We have to get, particularly, I will say, I'll single out white people, to when they see something that's clearly discriminatory, to speak up and say something. We've had conversations with people in the community here in New York, where we see white people come forward and anonymously tell us, I live in this building and the landlord is seeking to evict all of the Black tenants or all of the immigrants in the building. It's just horrible. And I've been firsthand witness to it occurring and so forth. And we say, well, would you be willing to file a complaint with us? No, I won't do that. I won't get involved and so forth. That's the kind of lack of courage that is going to allow systemic racism to continue in this community. And I think we have to start, not only do the people who are breaking the law need to be held accountable, as Bryan said, but we need to start holding all of us accountable for speaking up when we witness actions that are discriminatory, when people express biases in an office. I think people need to be a little more active in combating those kinds of biases when they occur. That's the only way we're going to change the culture of some of these institutions, is for people to show some courage and initiative and confront people about it. And you see more of that happening now, I have to say, in various communities. More white people are speaking up about violence. They're joining with anti-racism efforts and so forth. But we're still not, where we need to be in terms of changing the entire culture. So we have a lot of work to do.
Taniqua, if I could just add something quickly to that.
Yes.
I think a lot of people also don't fully get that segregation is a distortion of the market and that they, regardless of their background, are actually harmed by it, that the gross domestic product of this nation could be a lot higher if we address these issues, and that for even individual cities, I've seen studies talking about Detroit and Chicago, just how their GDP could be billions of dollars greater if they were more integrated, even as integrated as some other cities which are not very integrated. And so I think there's a need to put out more data to help people see how all benefit from more integrated communities. There is data showing that white students benefit from integration, not just the associations with others, but actually in terms of test scores as well, that there's, you know, greater success. And even our implicit bias training folks have talked about this, that dealing with multiracial environments sharpens people's critical thinking. But just, yeah, I mean, segregation really, we sort of threw a spanner in the works by segregating our community so much. And now, whether you're talking about the economy or education or even health, we've really just distorted things and are costing the public in general a lot more because of the segregated society. So we do want to spend some time marshaling more of this data because, you know, just because it's their moral obligation, but, you know, the economy would be better and realtors would do better if we had more diverse, inclusive communities.
So speaking of culture, you may see a few questions in there from Leslie Hammond, who is a Bridge Committee member and one of the people who helped us bring this event together. So thank you, Leslie. So Leslie, she said there's a lack of focus on diversity here in Connecticut, and that the group of Black realtors doesn't, I think it's called NARIB, they don't have a committee here in Connecticut. So she asked if you can talk a little bit about what other associations are doing across the country. Is there a mandate for leadership? She mentioned that I think the whole board and by 2021 will be white. And so she just talked about, you know, needing more conversation focused on diversity in Connecticut. So can you please share what other associations are doing across the country?
Yeah, well, it is a focus of many associations. I mean, first of all, NAR does have a diversity committee, and one of its goals is to help different state associations and local associations replicate, you know, the diversity commitment and help those state and local associations, you know, create their own committees as well as promote greater diversity within the associations. It's a problem, you know, even within NAR too. I mean, we have committees that are focused on diversity, but we don't necessarily see diversity throughout our governance. And so people are talking about this all the time and the need to do more. NAR, though, is renewing its commitment to these issues. One of my colleagues, Andrea Moore, who had been the director of talent for NAR, has now taken on a position as vice president dealing with diversity, engagement, and inclusion. And even prior to her taking on this role, the time I've been at NAR, she's been convening many of us, those of us who work on fair housing, which is dealing largely with the external situations, but also our diversity folks, our strategic thinking people, and trying to bring all of this together. And that also includes looking at, you know, our support of the state and local associations. So there is a recognition that NAR needs to look at all of this holistically, and that, you know, NAR as an association, we're just a small piece of it. So there's the desire to support and help the state associations carry this through.
Okay, and so we have a question from Gina. She says that she's hoping to hear about panelists. Well, she's hoping to hear from the panelists. And she's hoping that you can talk a little bit about the connections between housing and schools. For example, how school quality, both real and perceived, affects real estate values. And that goes a little bit back to the myths that we talked about. And pretty much how the real estate industry can and does influence, for better, for worse, dialogue and decisions about schools. So the redistricting, rezoning, and the good and bad, the conversation that people often have about the good and bad schools, which are more than likely racialized anyways.
Well, I'm happy to take a stab at that. And that is the Newsday investigation provided a lot of evidence that schools were used as a way to steer people based on race. That perceptions among agents that more diverse school districts were less desirable for white homebuyers to consider if they had families. That and then that somehow minority homebuyers with families would be more comfortable in school districts where there were more minorities. And those assumptions carried over into their actions. And I suppose at some level, Bryan and I might talk about how some of that is implicit bias, but some of it was also pretty overt, where people were fairly conscious of the fact that they were advising one person that this school district should be avoided at all costs, a white person, and then telling another person what a great place this was and that the schools were great. And both can't be true. So somebody's lying to somebody in this situation. And I think we have to be aware that those myths are out there. And, I've heard stories, this is not in the Newsday investigation, but typically school agents often express some biases when it comes to school districts that have higher Black and brown student populations when it comes to dealing with white families who are looking to purchase homes. Recently, I heard of an example where a school district had become more than 50% Asian, and the agent was basically suggesting that this white homebuyer might not want to move into that neighborhood, but not because in any way the schools would be inferior, but because their kids probably wouldn't be able to compete with the Asian students that were becoming the valedictorians and getting subsidies to go to college and so forth, that their children might have a better chance in a white school district for an entirely different reason than would be cited with a school district that's has a large Black and brown student population. So we're hearing it all, but people, one of the things I said after the Newsday study is real estate agents need to know they are not experts on schools and education. And if they begin to pretend they're experts on that, they're going to get themselves in trouble because they may harbor some of the same biases that are pervasive in various communities. One realtor in the Newsday study really horribly badmouthed the Elmont High School district as a place for white students to go. And Elmont has a 96% college referral rate, upon graduation from that high school. And yes, it has a lot of Black and brown students, but it has a very good reputation for being college prep for people. So why would that realtor discourage a white family from going into that area? It just boggles the mind in many respects.
If I could say one thing on that quickly, I know that you all saw Segregated by Design, the Richard Rothstein film, which is also available online. Richard Rothstein, who wrote The Color of Law, started his work or spent his career really working on education segregation issues, and then backed into housing because he saw that they were related. But he points out that there are many parents who favor certain school districts because they look at test scores and they believe the test scores are a statement of teaching, when he says that test scores are actually more correlated with income, so the income of parents. So if you're not necessarily of that income and you're white and you're thinking, oh, this is a better school district for me, you're not necessarily going to your students aren't necessarily going to do better because they're in that school. It's just a reflection of the income of the parents of many of the students. That said, I think people discount how much race is really figuring into school choice. I just happened to be reading a story today just about what they call the Southern segregation academies, and just how throughout the South, when schools became integrated, private schools sprung up for white students to go to. There's still just a lot of bias in this country when it comes to who students or who parents want their children to sit next to in school. And it's not just the perception necessarily that those schools are going to be poor. So it's a real mixed bag, and it's really hard to disentangle how much prejudice is also motivating those decisions, whether it be the consumers themselves or the statements that agents might make.
Okay. Yeah, so we're pushing up against time. So I'll just ask one more question, which was asked by Deanna Crooks, another Bridge Committee member. She asked that if you're aware that a lender is employing discriminatory practices, how do you go about reporting? And she said it brings to mind the practices that Liberty Bank had adopted. So how should someone report those practices?
Yeah, I want to give a big shout out to the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, which has been doing work in this area for decades. And they've done lots of testing on this. They've done reporting on this. They've brought cases, and the Liberty Bank case is theirs. So I would encourage you to report anything you're seeing to them, and they will follow up.
I was going to echo that as well. Fair housing groups around the country will be happy to take complaints, and they can be anonymous. They can be just tips that are made. But I think anything like that, we're receptive to receiving and investigating.
Yeah, and don't forget, as a real estate agent, you also may be a victim of discrimination. And if you're denied a commission, or if you're just given the runaround because of someone else's discrimination, you have an injury. So just remember, these laws are there to protect you as well.
Okay, and so we're wrapping up, but I did see one question up there. So please, Bryan or Fred, feel free to, or anyone, please feel free to answer this in the chat. Someone asked if you can share any initiatives or programs that assist racially and economically marginalized groups in reaching home ownership. So if you can just drop the names of those organizations in the chat, that would be helpful. But thank you so much, Bryan, Fred, and Erin, for sharing your knowledge with us. This was an event, as I said, that we tried to put together for months. It was supposed to be in person, but the webinar turned out just as good. So special thank you to our webinar sponsors, CADIC, and again, NAR, the National Association of Realtors, and Open Communities Alliance and Bridge are the organizations, again, that put this webinar together. If you need to find out more about OCA, you can visit us at ctoca.org. If you need to find out more about GHAR, you can visit them online at gharonline.com, and there's a link to the Bridge Committee there. They also have a Facebook group, and some of the members are in the chat. I'll pass it on to Erin, but thank you to all the attendees who tuned in and asked questions. I hope that this was helpful, and I hope you learned something new today. Erin.
So first, I want to say thank you to Taniqua Hughley for doing an outstanding job moderating this entire event, getting it together, and phenomenal. So thank you, Taniqua. It's been great working with the Bridge Committee of GHAR, and obviously with Fred and Bryan. So thank you so much. I just want to share very quickly a few thoughts about moving forward. One theme that has come up is this notion of maybe some groups where realtors around the state who care about these issues can come together. So, that might be something that happens on its own. It might be something that's convened through the Connecticut Association of Realtors. But there obviously are people interested in this, and I think there might be some really great ideas for trainings and discussion that come out of a collection like that. Another thought is just partnering potentially with the Connecticut Department of Consumer Protection, which is involved in the licensing and does some training, and that might be an avenue for doing more on this. The testing program is self-testing is a really interesting concept, and I think if folks in Connecticut are interested in that, it might be worthwhile to reach out to Bryan and talk about how they're doing it at the national level. And again, I just want to give a shout out to the Fair Housing Center and recognize all the work they've done on this area, and make sure that people realize they're a resource out there and a great place to connect to on these issues. So thank you everyone for attending.
Awesome, thank you.